This is a story I don't often tell. I promise sincerely that this has scarred me for life, and although I've looked into psychological explanations for what I heard and natural explanations for what occurred, they remain unsatisfactory to me. When I was a child, I was very scared of the dark. I swore to my mother I heard voices in it. They were not evil, but they were not familiar to me, so they scared me. It was not uncommon in the middle of the night for me to wake up and hear whispers, as I would call them when asking my mom. She figured they were just bumps in the night and typical kids' nightmare material. I tried often to explain to her that it was more than that they sounded different from one another the way people's voices do. On some nights I would get so scared from these whispers that I would sleep in my mom's bed with her. It was an added bonus that the bathroom was directly outside of the bedroom door for my late-night bathroom escapades. I should add at this point that when walking out into the hall to go to the bathroom, you look directly down the stairs that would lead you into my living room on the first floor, as my mom's bedroom was on the second. On one such night, around Christmas, I awoke and felt the need to relieve myself. I walked out from the door and distinctly heard the phrase, "Look!" And to my astonishment, a red light, almost like a spotlight, was cast upon the wall at the very bottom of the stairs. The light had no other source, it was by itself, and I was transfixed by it. Being a little kid, and it only being a few days from Christmas, I knew what the light was. It had to be Santa. How else could he get into my house to know I was being a good boy? I was so excited I began walking down the stairs to greet him, picking up my pace after the second step, as it began to creep off the wall and fade into the darkness in my living room. That's when I heard him. A very strong masculine voice, different from the first. Not at all like my father's. Not to say he isn't masculine, it was just distinctly different. It said, "Stop. Right now. Go back up those stairs." I listened, turned around, and what happened next I am not sure I would believe if someone had told me this same story. After reaching the top of the stairs, I heard a very loud crash that sent me running back to my mother's room, where I jumped straight into the bed and under the covers and stayed there the whole night. When we awoke the next morning, the poinsettia lights, these little Christmas flower lights that glowed red, that my mother and I had put on the railing down the stairs, were pulled straight down to the bottom of the stairs, some broken from what seemed like a forceful tear, laying in a single pile. The dry sink in my living room had fallen from the wall. My mother couldn't explain it, and my father was worried that we had been the victims of a home invasion, and my sister was crying. There was nothing missing, nobody had broken it, and there didn't seem to be any reason that any of this had happened. And then I saw it, and I kept quiet about it because I was so afraid that I could not force words out of my mouth. There, on the edge of the wooden dry sink, which had been facing up, were 3 indentions where the finish on the wood had been worn, almost as if in a forceful grip. Something down there had grabbed it and threw it down. That was what the bang was earlier in the night. I was mortified, and after that day I never heard a single voice again. I don't like to imagine what was waiting downstairs for me that night, if anything at all, but I can tell you that the reality was that something had physically acted upon 2 things in my house near the bottom of the stairwell. After this, I had never heard another whisper again, which is sad because in some ways I would have liked to thank the man, or whatever it was, that had stopped me from going down those stairs. This happened when I was 7, and I'm 20 years old now. Because of this incident, I'm still afraid of the dark, especially shadowy stairwells. When I was about 17, I was winding down to go to bed for the night. I would guess it was around 1 a.m. I used to, and still do sometimes, stay up rather late doing my own thing, but this time I was talking with my mom, who had also stayed up. I remember that my dad had already gone to bed, though. I said goodnight to her in the living room, which was at the back of the house near a stairwell that led upstairs to my dad's, quote, man cave. This was when we still had one of those old TVs that when left on a certain channel would make a high-pitched buzzing sort of sound when nothing else was playing on it. I think it's called electromagnetic interference, or EMI for short. I heard this white noise and knew that my dad had left the TV on upstairs, so I went to go turn it off. I always hated going up there at night alone, because it was filled with antiques and family heirlooms from people who had since passed, including old pictures, paintings, and religious things. Plus, we had a couple of unexplained encounters occur up there, including bangs, things being moved on their own, and crosses falling off the walls. I had never specifically seen anything at that point, but I had heard stuff. Anyway, I got up there and indeed the old box TV was still on, So I just turned it off and quickly went back downstairs. I had realized that I forgot to mention to my mom about something that had happened to me at school that day, and quickly went to tell her before I went to bed. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I do remember laughing about it. I said goodnight again and headed back down the hallway towards the living room. As I was passing by, though, I heard that high-pitched static noise yet again. I thought to myself, I already went up there and turned that off, didn't I? Because of my ADHD, I knew that I could be forgetful sometimes, but this wasn't the case. I very specifically remember going up the stairs and looking around a bunch because I was admittedly terrified. I end up just rolling my eyes, sucking up my fear, and going back up the stairs. The room has an open balcony that hangs over the edge of the stairs coming up, so anyone is able to see inside the room before reaching the top of the stairs. I slowly climb and peek over the edge of the balcony to see inside the dark room. The TV was indeed on again, because not only was the noise louder, but I could see that faint hue of the backlight illuminating a part of the room. Something then caught my eye to the right, and I turned to see my dad's computer chair slowly starting to swivel around. It was one of those spinny office chairs, and he had it placed right under the air conditioner so he could keep cool. I tried to keep rational, and I thought maybe that the air is just blowing it around a little. However, the chair then quickly jolted around to face me and completely stop. It was so sudden that it didn't even process in my mind. The room was definitely lit up enough to where I know I wasn't seeing things, and yet I had never seen anything so unexplainable like that happen to me before. Chills started to immediately run down my arms, back, and legs when the chair then tipped forward like someone was getting out of it. At that point, I just said nope, literally leaped down the stairs and ran straight to my room. I called my then girlfriend, who I could clearly tell I had just woken up from sleeping. I didn't really care though, and I proceeded to tell her the whole story as I watched my door waiting for something or someone to open it. Alas, nothing else ended up happening, but I was still close enough to hear that ringing from the old TV upstairs all night. My house was built in 1904. It's a single-family home, wood-frame setting on a concrete block foundation. I've been living there for about 12 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and I have seen or heard in the house, this one event is my favorite. This happened to my brother. About 10 years ago, my brother and his best friend had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, alternative music but in Spanish. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice into the early evenings and eventually call it quits by 8 p.m. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed because I worked the graveyard shift. This happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter, and they had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddies so they could go load up the equipment, and everyone had filed out of the basement. The tricky part was that they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen doorway, down the hall into the living room, and out into the front porch. Everyone was outside sitting in my brother's truck waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left his pancakes in a to-go container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He then made the decision to go back and get them. Now, the basement is not clean, with full sight lines. There had been partitions made, and the boiler and the main heating unit are right smack in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he's about to retrieve his food container when out of the corner of his eye, he sees it. It's a shadowy figure, right at his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over my brother. We had been taught that if you were in the presence of a spirit or a ghost and you felt a bad vibe, to say a quick prayer or to cuss at it. My brother, of course, chose the latter. He basically just told it, "Hey, fuck you, I don't have time for this shit." My brother started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch is on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily, the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding the living room with its amber light. My brother said he felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch, the living room went dark, as the rest of the house did too. As he stepped out of the house, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him. Still holding his food container in one hand, he jogged down the few porch steps, and he walked towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friends in his truck, he smiled and thought things were over in his head, mad at himself for spooking out when there really wasn't a reason to. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of his house, when one of his friends asked, Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us? My brother answered, What do you mean? He went to work early tonight. He's already gone. Do you see his car anywhere? The next question they asked, So then who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house? I'd seen weird stuff before, like my deceased grandfather standing in a doorway appearing alive, well, happy, and dressed in a fuzzy, snazzy white suit, but I would just blink and whatever ghost I saw would be gone. I would just chalk it up to a momentary brain fart and move along. One night in 2005, though, when I was 18, I was chatting with some friends on AOL Instant Messenger. Remember those days? I told them I'd BRB and went out the back door to get my CD collection out of my car. Remember those days? It was around midnight with clear skies and a full moon and good illumination. I wasn't the least bit scared or nervous because I had literally done this 1,000 times before. My mind wasn't on anything the least bit supernatural. After I grabbed my CD case, I turned around to head back in when I saw her standing there near the garage at the front corner of my house. She was about 35, an attractive brunette with light blue eyes wearing an 80s-era peach-colored nightgown. Her body was facing away from the house, and she had to crane her neck at an uncomfortable angle to watch me. She kept playing with her run-of-the-mill crucifix necklace. She was giving me this maternal, admonishing look, like when a child disappoints its mother. If it wasn't for this slight, otherworldly glow to her, I would have thought that she was a crazy neighbor. My next thought, I'm seeing shit. I just blink and she won't be there anymore. So I do. Wrong. She was still there, eyes fixed on me, playing with that necklace. I walked to the edge of our property line, about 12 feet away from her, and slowly made my way to the back door. She never changed the orientation of her body. She just rotated her head like a sentry gun to keep me in her sights. She followed me with her eyes until I ducked behind the back corner of my house. When I got to the back door, I locked it up, shut the curtains, and proceeded to tell my AIM buddies all about what I had just seen, adrenaline pumping through my veins to the point it was difficult to type. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I've never had a 30-second hallucination before or since either. I can't explain her away. Okay, I haven't told anyone this story since I was a child, because when I told my cousins what was happening, it scared them really bad, and I got my second only whooping with my belt from my dad. As an adult, I don't mention it because I just don't know what it was, and I don't want other adults to think I'm nuts. When I was in second grade, I woke up one summer night, dead of night, to a woman floating through my window into my bedroom. Oddly, I wasn't that scared. I just sat up and asked, "What are you doing here?" I remember that she answered me, but oddly enough, the next morning I couldn't remember what she said or even what her voice sounded like. I couldn't even remember what she looked like. So next I said to her, in true 8-year-old fashion, "Well, you better get going because my dad might wake up and then he'll get mad." She slipped out of my already cracked open bedroom door and I went back to sleep. Sounds like sleep paralysis, right? Wrong. The next day I was really excited that I had my own fairy godmother and I named her Crystal. I thought in my head, please come back and wake me up at dawn so we can talk. I shit you not, the next morning, just as it was getting light outside, I hear someone whispering my name. I realized that this shit was real, and that she was a ghost, and I froze. I stayed as still as I could, not even able to breathe. I just prayed as hard as I could, go away, go away, go away. I could feel her right next to my head. As I'm typing this, tears are actually coming into my eyes. Okay, happened once. Coincidence, right? Nope. Every time I would get brave and say out loud to her before going to bed in my room, "Okay, come this time, I swear I won't get scared." She would come, whispering my name, and I would almost shit my pants in fear and never open my eyes. So at this point I'm thinking, still could be night terrors, right? I mean, our eyes do have receptor senses to light that wake us up, thus causing me to wake up at dawn and hallucinate this shit. Here's where shit gets real, though. Next summer I tell a friend that this is going on while we were camping together. She doesn't believe me, says to me, "Okay, ask her to come tonight then." We're sleeping in the same tent and my friend wants me to see for herself. So I do. And lo and behold, at dawn, I hear her, calling my name and my friend's name. We don't move, she leaves, and we both sit up. My friend heard her too. She freaks out, tells her parents later that day sobbing, and I get in trouble for scaring the shit out of kids with ghost stories. Later that summer, I told my cousin this story, and before that night, she freaks out, tells her mom, and I get my ass beat for telling ghost stories again. I got pissed about said beating, and I angrily said out loud, "I got in trouble because of you, and I never want to see you ever again." And I haven't. Ever. Thank fucking God. And I just don't think about it anymore, and never when I'm alone at night. I was running on the trails at the Nathan Hale homestead, which was an 18th century farmhouse and property of a Revolutionary War hero. It was in Connecticut. It was only about a 10-minute drive from my grandmother's lake house. I could not find a map of the trails anywhere online, and there didn't seem to be any signage at the place. Just a bunch of random mountain bike trails in the woods. I was only going to run 4 miles, so I estimated that I would run for about 30 minutes, using my watch to keep myself on track. So I ran around the trails for a while, and nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. It was about 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, and the only sounds were the distant hums of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional squirrel or deer that scampered off whenever I came near. The trails seemed to wind around a lot, and if not for my better-than-average directional skills, I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes in, I saw something strange about 50 meters off. A finely polished, light-colored wooden coffin. I was a little weirded out, to say the least, and waited until I got closer for a better look. I rounded a corner where several old tree stumps blocked my view, only to find that the coffin had disappeared completely. Where it should have been was a clump of ferns. This was really odd. I turned around shortly thereafter and made my way back to the car. I was maybe a half-mile out when I heard a very distinctive knocking on a nearby tree to the rhythm of "Shave and a Haircut." Tuck, 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 tuck. Except no 2 bits part. I was a little spooked, but chalked it up to a woodpecker or something. However, not 30 seconds later, there it was on a completely different tree up ahead somewhere. Tuck, 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 tuck. I picked up the pace. The trail widened a little, and I could see way ahead to the entrance to the parking lot where my car was. There it was again, though, on a tree seemingly right next to me. Tuck, 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 tuck. I truly started freaking out and started to book it back to the lot. I was nearing the opening when time seemed to slow down. All of a sudden, it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. The birds stopped singing, and my simple Timex watch started to malfunction, making all sorts of beeping noises, and the numbers were glitching on the screen. The beat sounded impossibly loud this time, like it was hacked into every surrounding tree with a hand axe. Tuck, 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 tuck. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I anticipated hearing the 2 bits refrain, and perhaps worse. I burst into the parking lot and everything went back to normal. The temperature was back in the mid-70s and birds were chirping away. I looked at my watch, only to discover that it had gone completely blank. I stood there and stared at it until it flashed 12, Monday, 1:01, January 1st. My watch had reset itself. It had never done this before. I got into the car and started the engine. The clock on the radio display read 12. That couldn't be right. It should have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. I put her into reverse and backed up to where I could clearly make my way out to the main road. However, as I was about to throw the car into drive as it sat there, I heard a sharp rapping sound out the back window, like something hitting it with their knuckles. Tuck, tuck. There was no one else in the parking lot when I finished my run. No cars, no nothing. I didn't dare look back and hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events to happen, and I still can't explain it to this day. I used to be in the military, and the training bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed or inside a bag that we had zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? I mean, human error and all. Then came the instance that freaked everyone out. It was one night after lights out, and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us were drifting off to sleep and were lying in our beds, etc. Suddenly, he heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor. So thinking that it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and pretended to sleep. While he pretended to sleep, he heard someone right behind him, at the other side of his bed, going, "Don't worry, you can continue to pretend to sleep." I would dismiss this as a figment of his imagination, except about 5 other people around him heard it as well, including me. Creepier still, there was no one there, and it was the voice of a little girl that said it. For reference, our training camp was in the middle of an island, and was set up away from the main admin blocks. The islands have been closed by the government for army training purposes for the past 15 years, so there was definitely no civilians around, let alone kids. To make matters freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of female hair on his bed, neatly bundled up, long and jet black. Under his pillow was a note. Remember me? Now, as I said, we were in the middle of a forest, in the middle of an island, and at that point in time there was no female recruits or personnel on the island. Our bunks were locked up for the weekend and the duty sergeant had no idea that this incident even happened. We never spoke about it after that night. It still chills me to the bone thinking about it. My grandfather was a bad man. He was an alcoholic, extremely violent, and even tried to kill my grandmother in front of their kids. One of his less horrible acts was abandoning my grandmother with their 6 kids, all under the age of 12. Some of his kids maintained minimal contact with him. He lived about 30 or 40 miles away from my grandmother and the 2 kids who stayed in the area. When he was in his 80s, he was hospitalized and then passed away in the middle of the night. In the morning, his oldest child, one of my aunts, went to the morgue to identify his body and fill out paperwork. On her way, she stopped by my grandmother's to break the news. When she came in, my grandmother said, "Oh, it's a sad day. He died just past midnight, I imagine." My grandmother had begun to show more signs of dementia, or just basic old age, and so the weird comments weren't too out of character. And my aunt assumed that while at the hospital, one of her siblings had already called their mother to tell her the news. My aunt shook it off and drove to the morgue. When she saw the death certificate, she was shocked to see that the time of death was listed at 12:10 a.m. On her way home, she stopped back at my grandmother's and asked her who had called her to tell her the news, and asked why she thought that he had died just past midnight. My grandmother said, "He came to see me at 12:30 and we talked for a spell. He wanted to apologize for all he had done and you kids. I think he made his peace and was able to move on, so I'm glad for that." My grandmother then resumed humming, doing a jigsaw puzzle. This happened when I was 17. When I was still living at my childhood home, I was sneaking out late at night to meet some friends. I went through the back door of the house, and as I turned to face the door, I could just feel somebody watching me. I thought I was busted. I turned to look who had caught me, and saw a totally monochrome figure. Their hair was completely black, like blacker than black. Their face was like static, washed over white and gray, and they were wearing a dress that was between the 2 colors. No facial features, just the silhouette of a young girl facing me. I reached for the door as fast as I could, and when I went to shut it, it closed very quickly on me. I bolted through my yard and onto the street and couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I stayed at my friend's that night. Soon after this happened, I was up late one night with my mom watching a movie. My dad had just passed away. We finished our movie and said goodnight after turning the TV, stereo receiver, and DVD player off. After a short amount of time in bed, I'm jarred awake by the sound of static, with the speakers cranked up and the TV on with no input. My mom and I are in the hallway, surprised to see that we had both been awoken to an empty house. A few years ago, when I was 23-ish and graduated from college, I finally told my family about the first occurrence. Before I'm able to finish my description of the ghost, my mom finishes it for me, telling me that her and her friend used to see a little girl in our backyard playing in a sundress. She said that she looked maybe 12. Our neighbor, who was the original owner, shared a story with us about the family that originally bought the house after it was built. It was a young family whose daughter passed away from leukemia. She would have been about the right age. Looking back, the girl wasn't scary or harmful, and my sister had the same impression. To this day, I believe what we saw, and haven't seen anything like it ever since. I also want to say that my dog used to scare the crap out of me because he would randomly stare down the hallway to my sister's room, and he would growl with his hair on end. It would always freak me out, and I never connected the two until sometime after seeing the ghost, or whatever it may have been. I lived in a haunted apartment. It was 2 rooms, but one of the rooms was locked, and I didn't have the key. So I only had one small room as a kitchen, dining room, and bedroom, and a screened-in porch. There were two especially freaky events. One night, my girlfriend slept over, and she woke up in the middle of the night and said that she saw the bathroom door open and a shadowy figure standing in the bathroom staring at her. The bathroom was right across from the locked room. Another time I was jerked awake by the fire alarm going off, just blaring, but when I went to unplug it, the alarm stopped and no other alarm in the building was going off. A lot of things that happened could have been just my neighbors, but the way they happened was, well, weird. I would hear knocking. It sounded like someone tapping a spoon on a counter, coming from the downstairs apartment. It could have been my neighbor, but I'm not sure why she would do that every couple of minutes for hours on end, or in the middle of the night for that. I would also hear knocking on the walls. It sounded like someone tapping their way up the wall, like they were looking for a stud. I would also hear this weird moaning or howling that I couldn't trace the source of. Again, it could have been like the neighbor's dog or something, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her apartment. The apartment across from me had 3 tenants in a year, I think because it was just as or more haunted than mine. I had, I think, a unique way of coping. I named the ghost Pete, after a previous tenant's mail I would get from time to time, and I tried talking to him, basically treating him like a roommate I wasn't friends with. My girlfriend was much more freaked out by the situation than me, and basically stopped coming over for a few months, so I wasn't there much anyway. When I was, I felt like talking to Pete made the atmosphere of the whole place much more friendly. I also left out a sheet of paper with, quote, Pete's notes written on it, and told him that if he had any problems, just write them down. I still don't know if I quite believe in ghosts, though I find the supernatural fascinating. But that experience did push me closer to the science doesn't know everything about the universe camp. I lived in an old 2-bedroom, 3-story walk-up for a time in my early 20s in Toronto. A few days after moving in, my roommate Mike chides me in the morning for banging on the wall that separated our bedrooms and pacing back and forth across the apartment all night. We just agreed that he must have been dreaming, or it was sounds from other apartments, as I had done no such thing. We agreed that it must have been nothing and left it at that, but this soon became a regular nightly occurrence. Shortly thereafter, I started noticing at certain times in my own bedroom the cloying smell of cheap women's perfume mixed with a damp, musty smell. Imagine an old person's clothes left on a damp, musty basement floor near a litter box that wasn't being changed often enough, and you get the idea. What made it even weirder is that I would be filled with a sudden horrible sense of foreboding a few moments before the smell would begin. Mike flaked out and left only 4 months into our 1-year lease, which meant I was left footing the rent for the entire place until I could find another roommate. I had decided to try and sleep in his bedroom shortly after he moved to see if things would get better. The very first night I slept in his former room, I had an incredibly detailed and realistic nightmare of myself standing in the dimly lit bathroom of our apartment and cutting my own face with a large shard of glass while staring into the broken bathroom mirror. It was only broken in the dream. Soon after that, I started to hear the loud bangs at night and the flushing of the toilet in the bathroom. Several times the hot water in the bathtub turned on full blast in the middle of the night. One of the freakier things that happened not too long before I moved is the time I was woken up by the TV blaring Poltergeist on City TV at about 2 in the morning. At the time, the channel would always play movies late at night, but the fact that one time my analog TV, which I turned with a knob, turned on by itself at full blast was the time a movie like Poltergeist was playing. As a 4-year-old, I fucking hated tying my shoes. I was terrible at it and progress was just not happening. One morning I was throwing a shit fit because my mom told me to tie my shoes before we left the house. I was trying to avoid this horrible responsibility while crying and screaming on the 3rd or 4th step of our staircase. The ceiling above the staircase extended from the 2nd floor horizontally to the space above the 1st step, where it met a vertical wall that connected the 2nd floor ceiling to that of the 1st. Imagine a big upside-down L. So my punk ass is screaming on one of the lower steps, and my gaze drifts upwards after a few minutes. I stop crying immediately, and I go silent. I distinctly remember a man in a sharp black suit with the head of a boar, only blue and complete with tusks and fur, bracing himself in the corner of the ceiling, kind of like a ninja. He was above my head, just staring down at me. He didn't say anything to me, but I know what he wanted. My mom began to ask me what happened, noticing my abrupt change in mood, and I cut her off in a monotone voice saying only, "He told me to be good." My grandmother suffered from heart problems and worsening dementia after my father passed away, as they were very close. After a few years staying in a nursing home, she could just remember who we were, and that was about it. If you came in and ate breakfast with her, she would have forgotten the entire event by lunch. Anyways, one night we get a call that my uncle who lived in the next state over had committed suicide. We waited a few days until a quote good day when she was more mentally stable to visit Granny and break the news. We get there and start some small talk, but before we get to the subject at hand, she says, deadpan, "Well, I guess Jeff is the only one left." We ask her about it, and she tells us that Terry, the son we came to talk to her about, had shot himself. Mind you, he lived in a different state, and none of the family back home had any of the details yet, having no idea how he had done the deed, just that he had died. We asked a little bit more, and she basically told us that Uncle Terry had called her a few nights ago and told her he had just shot himself in the head. We later learned that he did in fact shoot himself in the head. So, either my uncle's ghost has better phone service than I do, scary, or he was still conscious immediately afterwards and was able to make a call, horrifying. Or he called her just before himself to say goodbye, which is absolutely depressing. And my grandmother interpreted it wrong, but managed to remember it all the same.